Review copy provided by PlayStation. So, Returnal. This is quite the compelling game, one that I saw a few times during PlayStation's State of Play events, though I never paid that much mind to it. I thought it visually looked really interesting, but I didn't really know what it was, and it kind of left my mind for a while. But then, I had a chance to play it. I, in fact, spent a little over 22 hours on it before I rolled credits, with still more stuff to unlock and more secrets to uncover. And gotta say, I ended up having a really compelling time with this title. For those who don't know what Returnal is, at its core, it's a AAA roguelite experience, which is a rare combination. Rogues tend to be made by indie devs on a lower budget. So it's a kind of game where maps are comprised of interconnected rooms that you have to clear, and if you die halfway through a run, you start from the very beginning. You lose all of your non-permanent progression, and with each run, rooms will be rearranged to appear in different order, the layout of the world will be different, the placement of items and upgrades will be rearranged as well, enemies may appear differently, so on and so forth. And an example of a roguelite would be Hades. Returnal is fundamentally that type of game, but there are a number of things that do set Returnal apart. While the game does borrow heavily from other franchises, ultimately the whole feels greater than the sum of its parts. So, imagine a roguelite structure akin to Hades, but with shooting and mobility resembling what you'd find in the game Control, with the dashing of Mass Effect Andromeda's jetpack, the combat pacing, and at times chaos of Doom, the exploration, equipment progression, backtracking, and lore unearthing of Metroid Prime alongside the series' sense of isolation and its setting of a ruined and abandoned alien planet, the creepy, surreal, sci-fi Lovecraftian vibe of titles like Death Stranding and Control, the bullet hell aspect of Nier except cranked up to 11, the unforgivingness of a Souls game, and at times PT-styled narrative segments. So take all of that, wrap it up in one package, and you've got a basic description of Returnal. And all of these elements combined make for what I feel was overall a pretty cool take on the roguelite genre, one that I had quite a bit of fun with. So the basic synopsis, the basic setup is that you're Celine, a space explorer slash researcher who crash landed on an alien planet, and you're trapped in a death loop. So every time she's killed, she returns to the exact moment of the crash. So her goal is to find out why she's trapped in this loop, explore and unlock the mysteries of this planet, hail a rescue, and get home safely. The game does a pretty good job of keeping the mystery intriguing via dialogue from Celine and audio logs left behind by previous versions of herself, and narrative is also disclosed through a handful of cutscenes and dream sequences here and there, and also via the PT-style psychological horror segments. And in Metroid fashion, you will also find alien glyphs and text throughout the world that you'll run into, and you can scan them in order to translate the text and get additional context for the story and setting. I wouldn't say this is a game that's rife with cinematic moments per se, but there's definitely a good amount of focus on the intrigue of the mystery, on Selena as a character, and the overall plot. And this stuff is presented well enough that I always felt like I wanted to find out more, and there are certainly twists and turns, especially towards the end, that I won't spoil. Now, speaking of presentation, I've got to say, Returnal, while it isn't the most graphically advanced game I've seen, it certainly makes up for that in spades with its visual and audio design and style. Visually, particle effects tend to have an entrancing effect. The variety of alien ruins and environments are generally compelling to look at. Enemies and bosses feel super unique in their mix of sci-fi and Lovecraftian. And as far as audio and audio design goes, it's fantastic across the board. Everything from sound effects to background noises to creature noises to the music. It's all, I'd say, top-notch. While this game doesn't have the overall visual fidelity and attention to detail and animations that are at the level of something like God of War or Last of Us Part 2, this is still a very pretty looking game, and a trippy looking game at that here and there. My one complaint as far as presentation goes would be that the game does suffer from performance issues here and there. Frame rates do tend to noticeably dip a decent amount, especially when there's a lot happening on screen, but never to the point where the experience would be significantly marred or would be rendered unplayable. But, you know, as you're playing, you will feel the occasional stutter here and there. But that aside, presentation is definitely one of the highlights of Returnal, and it's also worth commending the actor who portrays the protagonist. I think she did a really good job here as well, especially the way her performance gradually changes as the protagonist starts to psychologically deteriorate throughout the course of the campaign. I think she did a great job of representing that. But it's worth bearing in mind that the narrative is not the main course of this game. It is a substantial supplement to what many will be playing this game for, the gameplay. The core mechanics of Returnal are that of a third-person shooter, with Control again being the closest comparison I can make in terms of how moving and shooting feels, though the speed, pacing, and freneticness of this game I'd say is closer to Doom, with the added layer of having to maneuver around and dodge barrages of projectiles in bullet hell fashion. With this type of game, it is imperative that they nail the feel of combat, and fortunately, I feel like overall they absolutely did. Combat feels really good, really tight, really fluid, and really responsive, and most importantly, it's just a lot of fun, very arcadey. Guns feel impactful, in large part thanks to the game's spectacular sound design. There's a decent amount of enemy variety, each with unique and fascinating design elements, and each with unique attack patterns and bullet helly properties. And once the game starts mixing and matching various enemy types in larger arenas, that's when all hell breaks loose. Combat is further bolstered by additional mechanics like the overload reload system, so there's no ammo in this game. Your weapon, it's more akin to an overheating system that will require you to reload if you exceed that limit, and if you don't, then the weapon will automatically recharge its ammo. But if you're at a point where you're reloading, then you can hit the trigger button at the right timing, and if you do so, it'll quicken that process. So while you're keeping all of the chaos in mind, you're also keeping track of that reload meter, and taking advantage of that will greatly enhance your damage output over time. Another additional element is the adrenaline system that rewards you for not getting hit. As you kill enemies, as long as you don't get hit, your adrenaline level will increase up to level 5, and each level grants additional enhancements and boosts. It also helps that there is a pretty decent variety of guns to experiment with for each run. You'll encounter everything from pistols, shotguns, assault rifles, machine guns, grenade launchers, rocket launchers, and one or two more, I'd say, unique weapon types, and all of these lend themselves to different playstyles of gameplay and experimentation. You do have to unlock these one by one as you progress through the campaign, but unlocking them is satisfying, and testing them out and seeing what fits right for you is pretty satisfying. And not to mention that every weapon also has an alternative fire mode that is random. What alt fire you get is completely randomized. Basically, a unique, powerful projectile that, when used, must cool down before it can be used again. It's almost like a super. And there's a clever implementation with the adaptive triggers where if you hold down the trigger lightly, you'll feel some resistance. At that point, you'll be at regular firing mode, but then if you go past the resistance and click down all the way, that's when you are aiming with alt fire. And so with that implementation, it's very easy to switch back and forth between regular and alt fire. It does take a bit of getting used to, but it's a smart implementation that worked for me, though if it doesn't for you, you can change the control scheme so that alt fire is a separate button, the left shoulder button. So you combine the really solid shooting with the agile mobility, and you've got a pretty great combat system altogether, especially if you're into faster-paced shooters. Now, one complaint is that there are times when the camera can get in the way, and it's not always easy to know where cliffs are due to this camera perspective, and falling off a cliff in this game leads to a good amount of damage to HP that could hamper your run or, hell, flat out kill you, which did happen to me once or twice to my frustration. There's also platforming in this game, and while it is adequate enough, it's not the best. There are times when it could feel inaccurate, leading to accidental falls here and there. Another inconvenience is that the grappling hook in this game, which allows you to zip from certain points to other points, and picking up items are both mapped to the same button, triangle, so there would be a couple times when I'd grapple instead of picking up a heal on the ground, which could get a bit annoying from time to time. And there were occasions where melee attacks would not track enemies properly. So these are some of the minor issues that I encountered, but overall, these things aside, I didn't find any huge issues when it comes to combat. I thought it felt pretty fantastic overall. Now, what keeps Returnal fresh, fun, and at times scary is its roguelite nature and the fact that you never fully know what the next run will be like. Every time you die and start a new run, most things will be reset, so any items you picked up, consumables or upgrades, will disappear. You'll start with a basic pistol, you'll start all the way back where the ship crashed, etc. And a lot of things will be re-randomized, be it the order in which rooms appear, what enemies show up, what weapons, items, and upgrades present themselves in drops, chests, shops, you name it, and more. So the main goal of this gameplay loop is to survive and progress by learning various enemies' attack patterns and memorizing different room types for each world, understanding the best combination of artifacts, which are items that persist for an entire run. That's what they call them in this game, artifacts, alongside consumables and upgrades, finding weapons that best suit your playstyle, and just persevering. And it'll at times feel like you're beating your head against the wall. I am telling you, Returnal is not an easy game. It is not a forgiving game. It'll kick your ass, and you will die. A lot. Even by roguelite standards, this game feels like the difficulty is a step above. And roguelite veterans in particular will know the pain of being at the cusp of reaching that next checkpoint, that next major step in progression, being inches away from beating a boss or just being close to making further progress, only to perish from an enemy that snuck in an attack, or from a mistake you made, or just from being overwhelmed by enemy forces, and that resulting in you losing all that progress and having to start all over again from the beginning. But in equal measure, I'd say the struggle is what makes victory that much more rewarding, and the feeling of overcoming an obstacle, challenge, or battle in Returnal does feel quite satisfying, despite all of the frustrations you might have to go through in order to achieve that victory. Now, mind you, the game isn't entirely unfair. There are certain checkpoints and permanent enhancements that provide a satisfying sense of progression, which is what a roguelite is supposed to do. So aside from unlocking new weapons as you progress through the main story and as you explore new worlds, you'll also find new permanent equipment that will grant you new abilities in the form of alien technology that will persist even after you die. And this kind of progression will remind you of Metroid. So as an example, one of those permanent upgrades is a sword that not only allows you to deliver powerful melee attacks against enemies, but it'll also allow you to break chunks of obolite basically being the basic money currency that'll allow you to fabricate or buy items and upgrades in shops. And on top of all that, with this sword, you can also break through certain barriers that will grant access to new areas and new items that you can pick up. Another fun Metroid-style permanent upgrade is the Grappling Hook, which can not only be used to great effect during combat to zip around, but also just in general grants faster mobility, as well as access to new areas and platforms. And you'll find these permanent upgrades as you progress from world to world and through the campaign. And so what you can do is backtrack to previous worlds using these permanent upgrades to gain access to once inaccessible areas that may grant additional items, artifacts, consumables, upgrades, weapons, currency, collectibles, secrets, you name it. The campaign, in addition to the permanent upgrades that you get, also offers checkpoints where once you unlock the gate to the next world, that gate will permanently persist. It'll be unlocked. You don't have to go back and look for the keys again, that stuff will stay, and you'll also be granted shortcuts to newly unlocked worlds, and these shortcuts will be opened up by some of those Metroid-like permanent upgrades and equipment that you acquire as you progress. Another form of permanent progression is that you'll unlock new types of items, artifacts, and consumables as you find them and scan them, which will then get added to the pool of things that can yield via drops, chests, item fabricators, you name it. The pool of tools at your disposal that will randomly drop will increase as you keep playing the game. And also, weapons themselves have different skills and attributes that will permanently unlock. They basically have their own progression system that will grant new powerful effects. So the more you use one type of weapon, the faster you will unlock these extra enhancements, these extra weapon skills. And at any point in a run, you can swap out between the weapons that you find throughout the world, and by unlocking these skills, you'll have a chance that those skills will be applied to the dropped weapons that you can pick up, and so the effectiveness of dropped weapons will grow as you play through the game. There is also one type of currency that will persist even upon death, called Ether, and this can be spent on this obelisk-like structure near the crash site to unlock new items that will get added to the pool that will permanently unlock. Or you can spend Ether on other things like a resurrection chamber that gives you an extra life if you have the Ether to afford it. So you've got all of these permanent progression elements layered on top of the temporary progression that will only persist for a run until you die, and you combine that with the fun and frenetic combat of Returnal, and you've got what is a pretty decently replayable and pretty addictive gameplay experience, albeit an unforgivingly challenging one. Now, some of the coolest encounters in this game are the myriad bosses. These encounters will put all of your skills to the test, and this is where the bullet hell aspect of this game really gets pretty freaking crazy. Aside from these being visually mesmerizing set pieces, they're just a whole lot of fun and can offer quite the challenge, especially if you're unprepared in terms of items, consumables, and upgrades you're carrying with you. Now, of course, if you die mid-boss battle, then yeah, you'll have to start all over again. That run you'll have to redo, with the only things that stay being those permanent upgrades you might have acquired. And you know, that is how roguelites tend to work, but I should note that unlike something like Binding of Isaac or Hades, whose runs tend to be on the briefer side, I'd say in the ballpark of 30 minutes per run on average-ish, Returnal's runs tend to be significantly longer than those games. I'd say Returnal runs tend to last around an hour between checkpoints and permanent progression, even more if you're doing real well and really taking your time and being really careful. It is a lot more tolerable to lose a run in Isaac or Hades because you're not losing as much time and effort and progression, whereas in Returnal, you could lose over an hour's worth of work if you died without reaching the next checkpoint, or if you died in the middle of a boss battle. And depending on who you are as a player, that maybe could be a positive thing, or it could be a negative thing, depending on your tolerance for this kind of stuff. On one hand, the fact that you have more to lose when you are killed in Returnal makes it that much more of a tense experience, makes you that much more careful, and it also makes victories that much more satisfying. But on the other hand, each loss can really feel quite painful, and redoing a run can be that much more demoralizing and maybe even tedious. Not everyone's gonna have a tolerance for this type of experience, this type of gameplay loop, and this type of challenge. Now, the counterbalance to all this is that whereas in roguelites like Isaac and Hades, you're required to fully clear a room of enemies before you can proceed to the next one, in Returnal, save for a handful of special rooms that do lock you in until after you defeat all enemies, you can actually rush past and skip rooms if you so desire, though it isn't encouraged that you do that too often, as skipping these rooms will mean you'll have less currency to buy items and whatnot. You'll generally just be less upgraded, so you kind of don't want to skip rooms if possible if you want to be prepared for the challenges ahead, but you do have the option to rush forward and skip things along a little bit here and there if you want. Now, part of what adds to Returnal's average time per run is just how big some of the rooms and areas in these worlds are. There are 6 worlds, or biomes as they're known in this game, in total, and each do offer their own distinct visual flavor, enemy types, navigation quirks, and layouts, and each of those worlds are pretty neat. But within each of these worlds, there are some rooms that are bigger than others, and some of them are really quite big. And for the first couple of runs and times, they're actually pretty fun to explore, but these larger areas can start to feel a bit tedious to navigate around after a while, because you've been through this over and over again, and you have to go through these large areas to find chests, item shops, currency, heals, upgrades, weapons, you name it, but you're wasting time kind of moving around a lot and just trying to get through the areas and the various platforms and everything. By contrast, a game like Hades keeps each room small enough where you're doing more fighting and moment-to-moment action than walking around, which I personally find to be better suited for a roguelite experience. Rooms that are smaller, more self-contained, where you're not kind of having to walk so much and jump around so much and just navigate so much that it feels like you're wasting a lot of time. So that's just worth keeping in mind. This might appeal to certain players. For me, for some of these larger areas, I could feel a bit of tedium kicking in, though not so much to the point where I, dislike the game or anything like that. Fortunately, despite some of the tedium that can set in with some of these larger areas and having to re-explore them over and over again, because of how fun combat was, I kept looking forward to what's next. I kept wanting to play this game. I kept looking forward to the next boss fight, as well as just making permanent progress, finding the next permanent equipment that'll allow me to navigate new areas and enable new forms of navigation. And the intrigue of the narrative kept me going as well. And so while there were frustrating, demoralizing moments when I died in inopportune moments, or when I was kind of engaging in some of the potentially tedious aspects of the game, I still kept happily going. The game kept me hooked. Now, as a roguelite, one area where I do feel the game falters is in the selection of those items that you pick up, or artifacts in this game, the upgrades and consumables that you pick up. To me, what makes a roguelite infinitely replayable and so fun each time I do a run is experimentation. The way you can make different builds each run based on the combination of items and upgrades that the game randomly awards you and grants you. In roguelites, oftentimes, items and upgrades will synergize with each other and at times yield some really crazy combinations with some really fun effects. That's something I haven't found to be the case with Returnal, at least not to the extent of Binding of Isaac or Hades. And this is because many items' effects are relatively passive, low-key, and somewhat basic in their function. They will often be increases to stats and whatnot, but they won't necessarily provide unique effects to your weapons and mechanics of the game and whatnot, like other roguelites items tend to do. While there are some consumable items that yield more active effects, like there's this one consumable that when you activate it, it summons a spike from the ground that attacks a nearby enemy, or another that summons a portal that acts like a turret that attacks nearby enemies. Even then, those offensive consumables just don't feel as effective as just using the weapon that you're carrying. They can be a nice supplement here and there, but I felt like they didn't make a huge difference. They weren't useful enough for me to remember them all that often. The items and upgrades that I kept seeking as I played through the game were ones that either granted me more max HP, would heal me, or would grant me an extra life. Those I felt were the most important. Self-preservation always felt more worthwhile and more effective than anything else and with any other forms of experimentation. There is some additional variety in the form of pickups called parasites, which are basically items that latch onto you and grant a boost in exchange for a boon. But these also tend to be passive in their effects for the most part, and more often than not, based on the negative effects, don't tend to be all that desirable. So as a roguelite compared to some of those other roguelites out there that I've played, in terms of quantity, variety, and effects of pickups, items, upgrades, you name it, Returnal leaves something to be desired. And I'm not talking about the permanent Metroid-style upgrades. Those are great. Just the stuff that will be wiped between runs that will go away after you die, that stuff leaves something to be desired. Returnal falling short on that front as a roguelite, I think will make this game less replayable than it could be, as there's nowhere near the amount of item combination experimentation that you'd see in other roguelites that feel infinitely replayable. It doesn't help that the game does feel a bit stingy in the frequency at which they hand out currency and upgrades and items. In part, I feel like this was intentional. This was them trying to add an extra layer of a risk-reward type of system, because you can really tell they really wanted to make this a challenging experience. But I feel like the stinginess got in the way of what makes a roguelite so fun. So in this game, fabricating items or buying items or artifacts tend to cost quite a bit of money, and that requires a lot of grinding for you to build up enough money to be able to afford just one of those artifacts or items. Chests often yield items or consumables that aren't super useful and will only occasionally yield some of the more useful consumables and artifacts. Throughout these runs, you'll also find certain doors and chests that are locked behind keys, and I generally felt like the game handed keys out so infrequently that I often didn't have the keys to open any of these doors and chests. And when I did, the rewards I found more often than not wasn't worth the expense. And then on top of all that, the game also has this mechanic called malignance. Basically, occasionally you'll find chests or items on the ground that are like glowing purple, a purpley smoke. And that means that the pickup is malignant, and if you pick it up, then there's a chance that it'll give you what's called a malfunction. Basically, a negative effect that you can only get rid of by fulfilling the listed objectives. And some of these malfunctions can be quite detrimental, and it seldom feels like it's worth taking that gamble of opening a malignant chest or looting a malignant item or breaking a malignant chunk of resources, because the drawbacks and inconvenience you can potentially get from these malfunctions more often than not feel like they outweigh the usefulness of the items you could potentially get. Now, you can get rid of malignance before picking up an item by expending the permanent currency Ether, but Ether is a decently valuable resource that I often found was better spent elsewhere than clearing out malignancy, as chests with malignancy, once I clear them, I often found yielded items that just weren't super useful to me. And I think this all ties into the fact that Returnal's pool of items is fairly limited, and even within that limited list, many of these items don't feel as useful as they could be. And there are certain consumables that have an effect for a limited time that could be useful if only they lasted longer. Those types of consumables tend to last around 30 seconds, which never felt like enough time to take full advantage of them, or never felt like they were worth deploying in the heat of battle. So I hope these are all elements that can be enhanced with future updates, or hell, with a sizable expansion. I'd be down for that. An expansion that could bring more quality, variety, and usefulness of items and upgrades that will allow this game to be more in line with something like Binding of Isaac or Hades in terms of the experimentation and combinations of items that will keep players coming back to do new runs just to see what kinds of crazy builds they can come up with. So for now, I'd call Returnal more of a narrative third-person shooter campaign with roguelite gameplay elements rather than a full-on roguelite game with a narrative-driven third-person campaign attached, which I think is by design. I think they were focused more on creating a campaign-like experience, and it doesn't detract from the experience, it just diminishes the longevity and replayability aspect. But with all that said, I do see myself still going back to this and replaying this game for a decent while longer, because combat really does feel great and addictive. Boss encounters are fantastic, and for my part, I feel like they're highly replayable. I want to experiment with other weapon types that I used less for my various runs that I've done so far. And not to mention, I still have a handful of artifacts, items, upgrades, and secrets that I still haven't unlocked, so there's that to look forward to. The last thing I want to talk about before I close out this review are bugs and glitches, of which I encountered very few overall. There was one time when this enemy that teleports around accidentally phased through a wall or a floor and got stuck. There was another time when this laser obstacle course didn't trigger properly. There were a few times when enemy AI would stop working and they'd just stand still as I shot them if I took cover in a specific way. There was one time where the game didn't trigger my input for a grapple hook shot, even though I was looking right at the location where the grapple hook would latch onto, and even though I was mashing the button, which led me to falling down to my death and having to redo that whole run, which that one really hurt. The worst bug I'd say I got was when the game crashed this one time. And crashes can be especially detrimental for Returnal because Returnal does not save the game mid-run. Basically, if you exit the game, regardless of where you were during a run, you're going to be taken right back to the beginning to the crash site. So that crash meant that I unfortunately had to start that entire run, though the good news is that this crash only happened to me once very early in my playthrough of this game, so it wasn't hugely detrimental. I haven't seen the game crash since. And yeah, that's about it. In the grand scheme of things, I feel like these bugs are relatively minor and infrequent enough that I didn't find them to be hugely detrimental. I'd say overall, Returnal is a relatively polished game with a few minor imperfections. Overall, I think Housemarque has created what I think is a genuinely fun, engaging, challenging, wonderful, trippy, visually mesmerizing at times experience, and one that can be unique in some ways. And an experience that genuinely pleasantly surprised me. It ended up being better than what the marketing made this game seem to be, and anytime a game is better than what its marketing suggested is good news as far as I'm concerned. And at the very least, it's a game worth picking up at some point for current and prospective PS5 owners. Even if you don't get it now and are waiting for a sale, pick it up one day and try it out if you're into the type of game I described. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my review of Returnal. I'm pretty happy I got to play this game, and I'll be happy to continue playing for a bit longer. So let me know in the comments below what you think about this game based on what you've seen, what you've heard, and what I've relayed in this review. And let me know if you're going to end up getting this game, be it at full price or ways down the line when it goes on sale. Drop a comment, and to be further updated on more game news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.